Welcome to Book Rising, a podcast by the Radical Books Collective. Hello everyone, my name is Bhakti Shringarpure and I'm your host for our podcast, The Book Rising, and I'm very excited to welcome Maaza Mengiste in the studio today. Maaza is an award-winning and multi-talented Ethiopian-American novelist, essayist, and editor. She has published 2 novels, Beneath the Lion's Gaze and The Shadow King. She's also the editor of a story collection, Addis Ababa Noir. Beneath the Lion's Gaze, published in 2010, was selected by theGuardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books and named one of the best books of 2010 by the Boston Globe, the Christian Science Monitor, and other publications. Maaza's more recent novel, The Shadow King, was shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize and was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize in Fiction. In addition, she has been a recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award and prestigious fellowships from the Fulbright and the National Endowment for the Arts, among others. Maaza's essays have been published in The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Granta, theGuardian, and the New York Times. We are also proud to add that Maaza Mengiste has served on the advisory board of Warscapes for several years and has been a generous supporter of our literary and cultural projects. Hi, Maaza. Welcome to the Radical Books Collective podcast called Book Rising, which rhymes with uprising. And I'm so excited to have you in the studio to talk about your work, to talk about the madness that's going on in terms of the amazing wins for so many African writers across the board, and to generally just talk about publishing and, just the world at large, how it's shifting, how it's changing. So let me start with my first question. So, it's very hard not to talk about prizes at this point. As you know, tons and tons of writers from the African continent or of African heritage have swept the literary prizes in the last year or the last few months. It's a long list. Okay, of course, the big names here are Abdul Razak Gurna, who won the Nobel Prize, and then Babakar Boris Diop, who won the Neustadt Prize. And then there's several in between. There's also Damon Galgut, who won the Booker Prize. So, let's just start there. What's going on? I don't think it's a coincidence. What's happening?
Well, first, Bhakti, it's great to talk to you. I can't remember the first time that you and I met, but I feel like I've watched your journey through Warscapes and now the Radical Books Collective and this podcast, and it's been amazing. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I have been watching with such glee, pure joy at the number of African writers that have become noticed by a wider audience. You mentioned Abdul Razak Gurna. There's, I think, David Diop, Nadifa Mohammed was just a finalist for the Booker Prize. And when I think about what is happening, I think one of the first things that I have to remind myself is that we have been here writing for decades, for a very, very long time. So it's not as if it's not like we've burst onto the scene, with debut novels. Gurna has published at least 10 books? Yeah, 10 books, and I think several essay collections. Nadifa has written several books. People have been writing. The world is slowly starting to broaden its thinking about the capabilities of literature and what exists within the the realm of African literature. So I think the world is catching up to what we have always known, is that the work is diverse, it is exciting, it is universal, it's global, but it's also distinctly, there's also something that is uniquely African about it, in terms of each of these writers working and from a very specific community, a specific family, a household. So I hope that the literary world has moved out of literary tourism of these African books, and really that it's become a more sophisticated reading, because the writers have been doing things that are far sophisticated, and audiences were not ready at that time, but maybe now they are.
I love that term, literary tourism. I have not heard that before. I wonder how come. But I think you're, of course, you're right. It's been going on for so long, especially for people like me who are academics and who've been assigning these books for so many years. It's not a surprise when these names kind of are winning bigger prizes. But of course, I think, what you're calling the world, or what I would call publishing circuits, are changing. So your first book was published in 2010, Beneath the Lion's Gaze. And then, you were doing all this incredible archival research. And then 10 years later, you were ready to publish The Shadow King, and that's when it came out. And I think things have shifted within these 10 years, for you, of course, you were probably not just a debut writer, you had made such a name for yourself. So, publishing Shadow King probably had lesser challenges than maybe the first book. But what could you say a little bit about what you found had changed with regards to diversity in terms of signing writers from the African continent? I know that for a long time, it was very trendy, like Indian writers who wrote in English. I mean, I think for like almost a decade or something, they were like the most dominant entity with prizes and publishing deals, like amazing publishing deals. So, in terms of diversity, in terms of signing Black writers, women writers, more translations, do you find something has altered?
I do. When I think back to my first book, I remember that one of the first questions I would always get is, what is an African writer? Or are you an African writer? That was the question for everyone. It felt like that was the discussion in 2010. What is African literature? What makes, and now I remember also some friends of mine, Indian writers, saying, oh, we got this too when we first published, just give us some time and people will eventually get tired of that question. But now 10 years later, I think that we're moving beyond it. I don't get asked that. I don't get asked where's home. I think the readership has begun to understand the diversity across the continent. We have writers now from Africa, whether they're diasporic or they live there, who are diverse. They're transgender. They are queer. They are, there's just a range of voices that have come out. The ranges in stories too have increased. And I also think that we are getting African writers who are the critics, who are members of juries, who are slowly moving into those positions. And I think that makes a difference in the voices that also get noticed, because they are calling attention to other writers, and I am grateful for that.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. That's actually a very crucial
Mm-hmm.
point when we think about who is kind of entering some of the more powerful positions and so on. Let's think a little bit about this question you used to be asked: where is home? I know that you happen to be a very much an Ethiopian writer with a deep and constant engagement with Ethiopia and the continent as a whole. You've spent so much time there. You're always going back. You have family, but you also have a base in the US. And whichever way one sees it, it's very hard to publish African literature outside of the bounds of a kind of Western publishing structure. Just that's just the way it has been. So I wonder then, has the subject matter of your books, your books are dense, they are about war, they are stylistically innovative. Have they been a challenge for Western publishing, or has it been easy?
Really good question, Bhakti. I think that my books have been challenging, and I think it's been challenging in many ways. First, when I was writing The Shadow King, and I knew that I was doing something stylistically that was different from me, at least, and I felt would probably be different for readers. I assumed that people would either love it or hate it, and there would be no middle ground, which I think is basically what has happened with it.
Let me stop you. There are people who hate The Shadow King?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I did not know. The reviews have been so wonderful.
Oh no! Oh my God, Bhakti! Scathing reviews from the UK, especially the UK. And I will tell you that an Indian writer contacted me when the book became a finalist, and she said, "I want you to prepare yourself for these journalists because they are vicious." Okay. And they were. There were a few of them. There was one headline that said, "Maaza Mengiste is no Andrew McCabe."
I don't know who that is.
Who? I didn't know who it is. I had to look it up, and I was like, "How am I being?" It was like there have been some really,
wow.
They've called it a disaster.
Yeah, I think I'm like a sociologist or something, where I just check how many reviews, and maybe I don't actually read all of them, because it's so important. Reviews are so important for books.
Yeah, especially during the Booker. I was absolutely convinced that they were just sending this signal that this not all of them, not, of course, there were just a few, but it makes me think. I was prepared for that kind of reaction when the book came out. I was actually surprised that I didn't get as much of it. I wanted to do something new, and I was prepared for some of it, but it has also made me question the kinds of books that readers will accept from white male writers, the kinds of innovations and risks that they will accept from a white writer, and the kinds of innovations and risks that they will absolutely not accept from, let's say, a writer from Africa. There's a level of trust that goes into the act of reading. And there's also a sense that if I am confused by something in a book, there are two different reactions. The reader can say, well, I trust that this writer knows more, and I'm just going to follow it until I get comfortable. Or there's going to be a sense of, my God, this is so confusing. How dare they? And then that's it. And I think that audiences are more comfortable in giving leeway to white writers, to white male writers. They're more comfortable in moving into their confusion because they they assume that that white writer knows more and knows something that they don't, so they're there to go along with it. And I don't think that we get that same leeway. I think riskier books, when they come from African writers, will get disparaged more because readers don't want to give them that trust, and they might get offended that a writer actually, an African writer, knows something that they don't know. So they'll speak of confusion as if it's a bad thing. And that is one thing that I think we still need to, those are discussions I think we still need to have. How much trust a reader is willing to give even these radical books that you're presenting requires a level of trust from readers. And there are readers who will gravitate towards that because they like the challenge. And there are others who don't want to be challenged by a writer of color.
Absolutely. That is so well said. One of the things, that happened with Gurna's win was the idea somehow that the UK has had a better kind of publishing ecosystem when it came to African literature versus the US. Do you think this might be true?
Oh, that is a really good question. I think that in one way, in terms of African literature, the UK has had more interactions with that population. Americans have the African-American literary world. But when I think about Gurna in particular, his books, even his latest book, Afterlives, you are not going to be able to find it in the US until August of next year, August 2022. Everyone was scrambling when he won the Nobel to get his books here. Of course they ran out in the UK, but they're not published here. Yeah. And that's I think a symptom of this larger problem. Bigger names get published in the US because the publishing industry has moved from being an arts community to being a corporation. I mean, we've heard this for so long, but it's shifted to what can make money, what can sell, and publishers and editors are less willing to take risks because it's all about that money. And we see with Gurna what can get lost. Yeah. And there's also issues of translation that we can talk about. The lack of translators in certain languages. I mean, like Amharic, or I'm working with a young translator right now, just in some ways trying to mentor him or trying to get him connections. He translates Tigrinya, and he's currently translating Paradise Lost from English into Tigrinya, and wow. I want to get him, and the stories that he's telling, try to get him with editors. These are the kinds of things I think we have to do on an individual level because the publishing world is not necessarily supporting that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. In academia, many of us find people who work on, say, African literary criticism, African literary studies, is always pitted in this very finite space of diversity with African-American studies. And that's actually the bigger problem, because the space can accommodate everybody, yet, whether it's corporate imperatives or just a kind of limited imagination, I think, one does one or the other for some reason, and I think in the US publishing, there isn't a sense that you're going to miss out if you hadn't published a Gurna. We'll publish him now, big deal, right? So there, it's a very different way of thinking. Another kind of way in which we get African literature is from the continent, and I think this trajectory is still very rare. Of course, the most successful within that is Jennifer Makumbi from Uganda, who had been publishing these kind of giant epic novels forever and ever, and then finally won the Kwani Manuscript Prize. And then the African community, digital community, literary community, boosted her work so much that it then came here. Do you feel this is a trajectory we can see more of, or do you feel like African publishing systems on the continent still require a lot of work? Like, what do you think about?
Your question makes me think about this woman that both you and I met when we were in Somaliland, Hilda.
Yeah, she works for FemRight.
Yes.
Also Ugandan.
Yeah, and she recently, not long ago, actually several months ago, sent me an anthology of South Sudanese female writers. Something that FemRight was publishing, and I read the stories, and these were women expressing themselves, expressing their experiences, whether it was through poetry or photography or short stories or nonfiction. And there was a range of skills, and I think a range of talents, but each of those stories felt significant because they were being, these women were being recognized. Their memories were noted, and they're being read. And I think about that book, and I think about the publishing that FemRight does as part of this African ecosystem that is within the continent, but I'm hoping slowly starts moving out, a bit like Jennifer Makumbi's story of someone who's doing fantastic work, and Africans know it, her community knows it, and then finally the rest of the world wakes up, and she's given a wider audience. There are systems within the continent that are working, and I think they're working for the people that need them. But I think that there's more, there's obviously more collaborations that could happen. There's more coordination that should happen. I think there's more training that needs to happen. I know that Seagull Books does training for editors and publishers in Calcutta every year. And what they do is will select a certain number of people who want to do this, and then offer training free of charge. And I was talking to Naveen not long ago about getting some Ethiopians there for that kind of training, because people are interested. It's just they don't know how to do it. And what Naveen's example says also is that we don't have to rely on the West, that there are collaborations that can happen between India and different parts of Africa. And there's a way that we can coordinate and not consider, what someone in the US or the UK might think or might disagree with, etc. So I think that we have to be doing those things more. And specifically, I go back again to translation, because that is going to be important. The more writers start working across the continent.
Yeah, translation is really the holy grail of that can change almost everything. And I love that you mentioned Naveen Kishore of Seagull Books, who's a supporter and one of the early people who has been guiding me through Radical Books Collective. So it's good to have him in there, and I love that program.
Yes.
The other thing that, your response makes me think of is that, like, that is the most East African response that you've given me, because I know if you were West African, we would hear a lot about like the Nigerian Cassava Republic, and all the people there who've been doing an immense amount of work. But of course, the continent is 50 plus countries, so we need everywhere to be invigorated, right? So let me get to that East African stuff. So you edited Addis Ababa Noir, and it's a wonderful, brilliant anthology, and I reviewed it, and at the time I was talking to you, and I remember you saying that you wanted to make it as inclusive and diverse a process. And I think it's Ethiopian literature is an extremely complicated and in the sense that there's so many different language literatures. It's also got such an old history, so talking within a kind of contemporary Ethiopian literature moment, bringing this stuff into the English language, I think it's one of the few ones recently that have reconstructed for me what is an Ethiopian literature. So, or at least made us think about it. I'm not going to say, oh yeah, it is the only kind of thing that brings together Ethiopian literature, but it's one that makes a big contribution. So just, how was the process? How did it all come together?
The process was, it was slow in some ways, because of the search for the writers, and the writers existed. It was just a matter of how to reach them, how to find them. I needed to get 14 writers, and and it was the challenge was in sometimes finding ways to contact them, but also a diverse. I wanted to get as the voices that were as diverse as possible, diverse in terms of linguistic, the language. I wanted to think about different experiences, different kinds of writing, gender, all of those things. And I was thinking of, the diasporic writers, but also people actually based still in Ethiopia. I was willing to work with people writing in their language of choice, and then, scrambling to find translators if I had to. And the way that this project started to come together was really exciting, because one writer would lead me to another, would lead me to another, would lead me to another. And so I realized that even if the West, and even if I didn't know all of these writers initially, they knew each other. They had their own ecosystem, they had their own communities and support systems, and they'd been working together for for decades. I wanted to think about stories that might express different aspects of what it means to be Ethiopian, from a diasporic sense, but also from a sense of someone who was living in the country. And so slowly it came together that way. And I was pleased with the way that it turned out. I really am thankful to the writers, because there was a lot of editing. I read these stories numerous times and gave them feedback, and they were willing to take it and do these edits, and then be patient with me as I was working on other projects and working on my novel. So it took a while, but I love the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that anthology. It's also truly noir, because we kind of see an Ethiopian history punctuated by wars and regimes and things like that. But that's not all it is. So, I think it adds a very unique, unique perspective on the region, because I think at the same time, Nairobi Noir had come out, and I had looked at both anthologies together. And, their definition of noir was just extremely different, or what they were seeing, what Peter Kimani was seeing as what constitutes a Kenyan literature, was very different. What did you arrive at a notion, even if it was or was not included in Addis Ababa Noir, did you arrive at some way of saying, okay, this is what Ethiopian literature is, or this is how I'm going to, engage with it?
I remember Adam Retta, one of the writers. I was in conversation with him not long after the book was published, and he said to me that he left Ethiopia during the time of the Derg, the revolution that began in the 1970s, and he said, you leave the country, but you never really leave. You never leave, whatever. And that moment, he said, for him is a place that moment in Ethiopian history, he keeps coming back to again and again. And I saw that reflected in a lot of these stories, whether the writer was diasporic or whether they were based in Ethiopia. So many of these tended to revolve around, let's say, the revolution, the aftermath of that, the consequences of this. And that was a definition of noir that felt very Ethiopian. That noir was the memory of war, memory of revolution, memory of conflict and the traumas of it. And that was surprising to me to see how many of these stories came up like that. And the noir of it was less about crime and more about intimate or personal terrors or horrors that might creep in from the outside. And that was really interesting to me to take the book as a whole and look through all of those stories and see what emerged. Yeah, I found that fascinating.
Yeah, that's great. It makes me think that I'm drawn to kind of literature from that region, but that's because, a lot of my scholarly writing and so on is to do with war and conflict and displacement. And sadly, a lot of East African literary and cultural production, fits that mold. And primarily I tend to work on Sudan and also Somalia. And then now when you say this, it makes me think that both your novels are about war as well. I was your Radical Books Collective did an event on food and food politics, and all the culinary heritage that we foregrounded was through war and displacement. So, these are sort of troubled circuits of literary, cultural, artistic production. And way more than Southern Africa or West Africa, East Africa tends to be implicated, or is somehow producing these war stories or these conflict histories. Would you agree? What do you think?
Yeah, I think these, the way that war and conflict is expressed, I think in many instances tends to be generational. The kinds of ways that a generation can talk about this conflict. So if I think about the revolution of the 70s in Ethiopia, there is a population that directly experienced that still has a hard time talking about what happened. And then there are the children of that revolution, those people born afterwards who are curious about it, who are asking their parents, who are doing the research to try to find out what's happening. They are the people who are writing this. But I think we have another generation that's coming now that is even another step removed from that conflict. and looking at other expressions of it, maybe not dealing directly with this, but talking about trauma in a different way, that still farther away from the conflict, but still looking at some of the consequences of it, if that makes any sense. Like the food thing, you know, for still communicating with that history, but seeing the many ways that that history has continued to impact different parts of the culture. And I think that's the case in Ethiopia. I'm thinking now of this book called The Parking Lot Attendant, written by a young Ethiopian writer, Nafkote Tamrat. And it came out, I think, a year or 2 years ago. And it's a surreal story of a father and daughter. And this is, for me, an example of the way that a writer can take this moment and do something wholly new, almost speculative, a fantastical kind of story. And this is what's happening. This is the way that things evolve in the literary world, and I find that exciting. Maybe Dina Mengistu's more recent books, I think, move further away from the conflict. But I think there are other writers, specifically people based in Ethiopia. I'm thinking of now 2 writers, Linda Johannes and Girma Fantaye, and they're writing things that are just on their own, that have nothing necessarily to do with history, but are speculative or really just dealing with social interactions, and they're making social commentaries, satirical, or they're funny. And I find that, I love that. There's some writers there that really need a wider audience here.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And The Parking Lot Attendant, I love that title. That sounds interesting.
Yes. Yeah, check it out.
Yeah, I will. Let me ask like a finalish question on my thing that I'm hung up on, which is, what is East African literature, right? With Gurna's win, with you and Nadifa Mohammed being Booker Prize nominees, we're getting a decentering of what is typically African literature, which is Nigerian and South African literature. I mean, I say we're getting a decentering, but Damon Galgut has won, so it's still there, of course. And I had a very fun podcast with Sudanese Scottish writer Leila Abu Leila, who had an interesting take on what makes East African literature different from West African. And she felt like East African connects with the further east, because of its oceanic histories and so on, whereas West African is a kind of different imagination. It's more, it's more internal to their kind of systems and circuits and spaces. So, I just wondered, what is East African literature to you? What are its themes, its styles? Is there something we can say about this?
Oh my goodness. Well, I do agree with Leila that it's that part of the continent is stretching to the east a bit more. I think that the writers there's a mix of cultures, there's a mix of languages, there's a mix of what is East Africa? When Abdul Razak, when I think of Nadifa Mohammed, when I think of, Jennifer Makumbi,
Yvonne Avour has an interesting comment on that, which is she kind of divides them into like the forest imagination and the ocean imagination.
That's it.
And I'm not sure it's like entirely like that, but like it's a fun rubric to have when you think formally.
I think there is something there about, like, it's between the ocean and the forest. And there's something even something is happening with language, even with the English language, that I like that rubric, that feels different, feels distinct. And maybe it is the way that the presence of English on the eastern part of the continent, maybe I don't, Kenya has been speaking English for a long time, but then you have countries like Ethiopia that are starting to, writers are starting to write more in English, and what you get is a different kind of vocabulary because of the influence of Amharic or Tigrinya or Afan Oromo, or another indigenous language in Ethiopia. And that's making an impact. It still has to be felt, I think, by an audience. But when I am reading those writers, I notice that there's a rhythm there that's very different. And I like that oceanic reference, because I think that it speaks to that difference I notice.
Yeah, it's a lovely way to think about it. And you've been so generous. You've given us so many lovely writers to read, and you've talked so openly about your experiences, these mean reviews, which I'm going to go look up.
Thanks, Bhakti.
I wanted to finally ask you about you. I mean, is there something you're working on? What should we look forward to? Is there a Shadow King movie coming up? Is there a new novel?
Well, I am working. I'm now in this very beginning stages of another book where I'm flailing in the dark, trying to find the story. But I do think it is another one set in war, but it's historical. And I don't know why I'm going back in time, but I think it's still dealing with World War II.
Joe Sacco, the Maltese American cartoonist or graphic novelist, he has this line in his graphic novel Palestine, where there's all these photographers and writers gathered around like something that's gone wrong, and he's like, well, I admit it, peace won't pay the rent, So when you say yet another book on war, I want to read that. It's Second World War. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, it is. And I am not sure how involved Ethiopia will be this time. So that's going to be interesting. That's all I will say. That I think I might be moving countries.
Wow.
But I have been thinking about this and planning on it for a number of years, even way before The Shadow King was published. So, but right now I'm at the point where I'm at the early stages of writing. So if there are writers who are listening to this and are working on something and feel very confused, they should know that that's part of the process, and that all of us go through that, and it's okay. Like at some point, the story will show up.
Wow. That's very good. That's very good advice. Thank you so much, Maaza.
Thank you, Bhakti.
Absolutely wonderful.
This was great. Thank you.